want to go out and like really do something.
I say it, I say it again. You've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked. Bamboozled.
It's a celebration, fellas. Fellows.
Always do the right thing.
That's it?
That's it.
I got it. I'm gone.
The way of the future.
The way of the future.
The way of the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and we are back. Season 2 of the Duel of the Greats podcast. So, first things first, Season 2, what's new here? We're not going to do more Steven Spielberg and Ridley Scott, even if you want that, I'm sorry to disappoint, but we're moving on to different directors. This season, for the next 13 episodes, we will have a duel between Martin Scorsese and Spike Lee. Now, these some at first blush you might think, how does a pairing work between these two? But well, that's why we have this entire season. We're going to figure that out. Now, a little bit of a change here. Last season, of course, I was the quote unquote Steven Spielberg guy, and Steve Shepard, our resident historian, was the Ridley Scott guy. Well, we're switching that up a little bit this year. He's not going to be either one of those. He's going to be our impartial judge, if you will, which the role was played last season by the professor himself, Nate Carter. This season, Nate will be taking the role of defending or advocating for Spike Lee, and I will be on the side of advocating for Martin Scorsese. So, how do we come to this? We'll kind of give a little breakdown of our thoughts. Nate, do you want to? You can kick us off here. Tell us why you wanted Spike Lee for this season, and why you feel passionate about advocating for him on this this go round.
Well, when you guys brought me this idea originally before season one, the thing that I loved about it was pairing filmmakers that wouldn't traditionally be paired and sort of finding those connections between them. And you guys, obviously, each of you had a favorite filmmaker in Steven Spielberg and in Ridley Scott. And we started to envision future seasons of different pairings of filmmakers. And Martin Scorsese was one that immediately came up for all of us just because he has a huge body of work that has now spanned decades, and he's been critically acclaimed for decades. And I started to think of who's a little bit more avant-garde, who's a little bit more on the fringe, that we could compare to Martin Scorsese. And the reason that I came to Spike Lee is because I think we're going to see right off the bat this week, I think there's a lot of similarities between these filmmakers. I think that they both are very much, personally, I think so far, much more than Steven Spielberg and Ridley Scott, uh, very much indebted to their cultural, ethnic, racial experience in this country. Martin Scorsese being Italian American and speaking from that perspective, and Spike Lee, of course, being a Black American and speaking about the complexities of that narrative and what that means to be a Black American in this country. So it's been very fun so far, just already watching the films for this week, and I thought it made a really good pairing. So that is why I thought these two would be good together.
Completely agree. And as far as Scorsese, like you said, we all knew after Steven Spielberg, Ridley Scott, or Martin Scorsese, he's a legend, right? He's one of the names. I mean, Spike Lee in his own right is as well. And it's so yeah, this is gonna be a fun pairing. And then just doing the research, like you said, watching the movies already, it's been interesting. And then doing just some light research. Steve has done the bulk of the research for us, given his historian role, of course. But I, just done a little bit myself, and there's actually some connections that you wouldn't have thought and wouldn't realize are there, which we'll kind of get into as we go further into the season. Steve is being attacked, but you guys can't see because we have video for us right now as we're recording. But maybe we'll do it someday. But Steve is being attacked by his cat. That's why we're doing
this one wasn't here during season one, so he's a new addition, and he apparently wants to be
Doesn't
part
know
of the
drill yet.
production. He's
Does not know the
literally
drill.
knocking it over. Bro.
So before we dive into the meat of the episode here, we want to have a couple disclaimers. Number one is the normal disclaimer, of course, spoiler warning. We're going to be talking in depth about all these movies. If you have not seen any of these movies and you don't want to be spoiled on them, do not listen to the podcast first. Go see the movies first, then come back and listen to us talk about this. We don't want to spoil things for you, but we obviously want to be able to talk about the movies in the fullest way possible. So please, if you have any worries about that, go ahead and watch the movie first. Just make it easier. Second one, and some very important for this season. Obviously Spike Lee is a black filmmaker, and a lot of the topics that he goes over in his movies are about the black experience, about black culture, etc. And we want to make it very clear we are four middle-aged white dudes who do this show. So, we
Dare I say aggressively white? Like if they could
we
see us.
four middle-aged white dudes with beards, except for Nate, who's clean shaven. But so yeah, so we're obviously have not trying to. We do not claim to speak for any black people at all, or try and tell anything about black culture. This is a lot of us just kind of learning as we go as well, but we're trying our best to try and understand what Spike Lee is a filmmaker, the point that he's trying to get across. And some of it we might not be able to fully grasp, just because that's not our experience. But I don't Spike Lee is not making these movies only for black people, right? He's making them for everybody, and part of it is trying to relay what the black experience is, so that we're using that as our sort of learning point a little bit, and again, trying just our best to deal about this in a responsible um a way. So, but we just want to make that clear from everybody, so that it's people are like, why are these white guys trying to talk about this, and all this stuff. So I get it, but hey, we're trying our best, and we're doing um talking about these great films. So first things first, the movies that we'll be discussing this week, just as we did last season. Last season, Duel and Duelist was the first, the namesake of the podcast. Those are the first movies for our two directors. And so we're doing the same thing this week, or this year, but we're going to double up on you. You getting two for the price of one this week, because we decided to do the first two movies for each director. Now, what's interesting about these is that with Martin Scorsese, the first two movies are Who's That Knocking at My Door and Mean Streets. And with Martin Scorsese, those two movies were two parts of a sort of thematic trilogy. Now, the other third part was a movie that he never actually made. It was only done in treatment form. So that never actually got made. So the only two that we ever saw are the two that we're going to talk about this week. And then for Spike Lee, we're going to be talking about She's Gotta Have It and School Days. And those are two parts of his sort of own thematic trilogy that ends with Do the Right Thing, which we'll talk about in a later episode. So we're gonna talk about, for these sort of thematic trilogies for each director, we're talking about all pieces of them, which is kind of cool. And so these, especially when you think you look at these first two movies for each director, they're pretty well linked, and they actually kind of match up with each other. It's just simply, I've seen like last season we found ourselves in this scenario a lot too, where like strangely weird connections between the movies that we just kind of thought would be sort of mildly connected, but are actually um especially with the first movies, but very thematically similar, surprisingly so. So that'll be kind of interesting to dive into with those ones. So kind of before, I guess we were last thing before we dive into each movie individually, do we want to kind of talk about our experiences? We already talked about why we want these two directors, but do we want to talk about our kind of first experiences with both of them? Steve, you want to start?
Yeah, I don't know that I have any particular memories of being exposed to either of these directors. Nothing that stands out like in season one was Spielberg and Ridley Scott. They just both kind of seem like they've always kind of been in the ether, the filmmaking ether, so to speak. I honestly don't have a ton of experience with either one. I think because of the aforementioned fact that we are four very white people. I think I've seen a few more of Martin Scorsese's films than Spike Lee's, because I think a lot of Spike Lee's do speak to the black experience so much. Um, but I've seen Do the Right Thing, which is the probably his best film. I think most people would say, and several of the others. Scorsese, he also had some breakthrough hits in, not to say that he's not a mainstream director. He wasn't ever one, but of course, when you're winning Oscars for The Departed and things like that, it makes it a little bit easier to see those films. Um, so yeah, I have no special affinity for either of these directors. I like both of their works that I've seen, and so I'm very curious to hear your guys' a bit more passionate take on it. And I will sit and be the most dispassionate observer and tell you both why you're wrong or right, as the case may be. I did also want to point out one thing. We technically Martin Scorsese's second film is Boxcar Bertha, but we're just ignoring that for the sake of continuity here. So don't worry about Boxcar Bertha. Apparently, he was even told by some other directors after he shot it, they're like, it's okay, but it's not that good. So you're fine, essentially. So we're skipping that one because of the thematic resonance of Mean Streets and Who's Not Coming. What about you guys, Nate? Why do you want to see Spike Lee so much in this second season of the podcast?
Feel like Spike Lee. Well, so what's interesting about both these filmmakers that is a little bit different, well, completely different than last season. And I think where you start to already in these first films see a lot of ways that they're tied together is both of these filmmakers, Spielberg and Ridley Scott, came up in a studio system. So their first film, even their earliest films, were part of a Hollywood studio system. Spike Lee and Martin Scorsese came up in an independent film system, that their first films are independently produced and independently made. And I think you start to see that resonance, that resonate a lot more in the personal level that these films really go to for each of the filmmakers. I will tell you that both of these filmmakers are filmmakers that are sort of what I call college filmmakers to me. I was really not too familiar with certainly Spike Lee. I was more familiar with Martin Scorsese, but I really didn't watch any of their movies until I got to college, and I of course I'd gone to film school, and so I got really into a lot of their movies at that time. Though my one fun fact about Martin Scorsese is Steve, you might remember me talking about this. Up until a few years ago, I would have said that the two most famous movies that I had never seen, the two most famous movies ever that I had never seen, one of them was Lawrence of Arabia, which I have watched in the last year, and then the other one was Goodfellas. I had never seen Goodfellas until the pandemic, and I watched it during the pandemic. Um, so really, I guess I wasn't. I mean, I'd seen other Martin Scorsese movies. There was no reason that I hadn't seen Goodfellas. I just had never had the occasion to sit down and watch it. Spike Lee, I really discovered in college and learned to love in college. I had some great film professors, which I'll talk about a lot as the season goes on, who really exposed me to a lot of the stories he was telling and the way he told stories. And I think a lot of those storytelling techniques are very much on display with these first two films tonight. So those are kind of my experiences with the filmmakers. What about you, Jeff?
Yeah, so for me, and if you listened to we all did our kind of at the last season or during last season, but for our podcast, we all kind of did our about us little recordings and stuff. So you've listened to those, and The Godfather was one of mine. I think it was one of yours as well, Nate's. But The Godfather is one of my favorite films of all time, of course. So becoming when I was young and I first saw that movie and I was obsessed with it, then I'm just like, okay, let's expand here. Let's get more mafia movies, more organized crime movies, right? And so if you're going to that area, your next stop from The Godfather is definitely Martin Scorsese and Goodfellas and Casino, um, and just all so much of his, The Departed, so much of his films are just kind of have that sort of through line in them, and it's a big part of what he is, and I think a lot of it too is tied to not just mafia, but New York and that specific sort of like neighborhood feel. And that's kind of one of the things that I think is most interesting going from season one to season two here. We had Steven Spielberg and Ridley Scott. How many times we talk about it? Guys, they were high concept, huge ideas, massive set pieces, things like that. But both these directors are very much, what I would call like street level, like very personal, very much more contained. There's not a ton of expansive sets in different locations. It's all about the characters and the city and sort of neighborhood itself. The settings themselves sort of become almost like a character on its own, and that's sort of a special ability that both these directors have to do that, and it's kind of interesting. But um yeah, with Scorsese, once I kind of leaped into the Goodfellas, going from the Godfather, then I was like, okay, this is great. Casino, I love. Then just kind of got into all his different movies, and especially The Aviator, one of my favorites, and The Departed, love that movie, etc. So that was kind of that. And then with Spike Lee, I never really had a ton of experience with him. Inside Man was the first movie of his that I really saw, and I was like, okay, this is really great. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna start checking out some of his other movies, and I still don't have a ton of experience with his filmography, so it's gonna be really cool part of this season is watching a lot of these movies, and uh, so that'll definitely be interesting. But yeah, that's our experiences. So I guess we can dive right in. Do we want to go director by director first? We want to go chronologically. What do we think? What do we think? I guess if we did chronologically, we would just be both Scorsese movies first. But
I think, why don't I go ahead and give everybody just a little bit of background about the movies? Again, if you haven't seen these movies, you probably should watch them before you listen to us talk about them. But I'll do a little bit of background, and then however you want to do it. Yeah, I say we just talk about them. I think some of the background might tee up some of the conversation pieces here. So She's Gotta Have It is Spike Lee's directorial debut, 1986, and then School Daze is his follow-up, 1988. I'm not going to bore you guys or bog you down with details, but as Jeff indicated, both of these, and I think Nate perhaps, these guys were not shooting for studios. These movies, both these directors, they had to hustle and get all kinds of personal funding from small time producers, family, friends. Spike Lee's grandma basically helped finance not this movie but another movie before that didn't actually work out. So these guys hustled to get these movies off the ground, and that's kind of reflected in one of the fun facts for She's Gotta Have It. It's as will become a recurring theme with Spike Lee's movies. There's a lot of family. He uses a lot of family, both as cast and crew. Obviously, he's in it, but his dad is a composer, and his love of film, in large part, I think, came from this. He talked about that in one of our sources, which I'll get to in a minute. But his dad composed all the music for She's Gotta Have It. He composed the entire score. His sister plays the roommate of the main character. The film opens with a bunch of still shots.
Can I interject on that for a
Yeah,
second?
yeah. The
So-
resemblance. Are you going to talk about it?
Yeah, like I swear. So I knew Spike Lee was in the movie,
Right.
and then the first time she comes on screen, like they show her from behind at first,
Yeah.
and then she turns around, and I was like, "Whoa, is that Spike Lee?" Like he looks a little. He doesn't have his glasses. Looks a little different. And then she started talking, and I was like, "Oh no, wait, that's a woman." And then I was like, "This is weird." And so I looked it up, and it was his sister. I was like,
That was
"Okay,
the
this makes
80s,
sense."
but I don't think it's changed that much.
Yeah, exactly. No, and yeah, they look very similar.
Yeah, they really do. And I think it's the eyes. They very much have similar eyes. But yeah, that was pretty funny. One of his brothers shot all those still photos that open the movie all around New York. And another brother basically was a gopher on the show. So, excuse me, the movie. So it's a family affair. Two, fun fact. Obviously, Spike plays one of the characters, Mars Blackman. The reason he played him is not any sort of, desire necessarily to be an actor, but they just literally didn't have any money to pay anybody else. And so he's like, fine, I'll do it. And it turned out to obviously be the start of, a pretty long and successful acting career as well. I mean, they're mostly his films. I'm not sure if he's been in much that's not his. We can talk about that later, but
Well, that character, yeah, that Mars Blackman character was in all the commercials with
So-
Michael Jordan. And
that
like he
kind of
basically
leads.
spun this character off, yeah, into like this commercial thing that like everyone loved this character.
So that's not necessarily one of my fun facts, but I definitely wanted to talk about it when we talk about School Days. School Days maybe is, I don't know about a flop, but School Days is not as successful as it is at the box office, and in terms of further fueling his ascent. Without the Mars Blackman, it's got to be the shoes commercials. School Days debuted on All Star Game Weekend of 1988, and Michael Jordan went off in that game, and the commercials were going right then, and it just was kind of this synergistic moment that fueled the rise. And it's not just me saying that. That is one of his biographers. Let's call it segue, folks, to some of our sources. The first one is Spike Lee. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it, as told to Kaleem Aftab. So this is basically interviews with Spike Lee. It's from like 2002, so it's 20 years old now. So there's going to be a lot of the newer stuff that isn't covered, but it's pretty fascinating. It's got lots of stories about his life. I highly recommend it if you're interested at all. Then I got Martin Scorsese, A Journey by Mary Pat Kelly, and Scorsese on Scorsese, which is a collection of interviews. So we're going to hear straight from the horse's mouth on both of these directors. So that's jumping around a lot, but those are our sources. Those were a couple fun facts. I don't want to get too much into the box office or the budget. None of these things were killers at the box office. She's Got to Have It, probably the biggest in terms of pure budget to the box office. Shot out 175,000, made 7.1 million, which obviously is quite the return. School Days was 6 million and made 14 million, so that's a success by any reasonable measure. And in fact, the studio that picked that one up, their other main feature that year was Action Jackson, starring the late Carl Weathers, and that movie made like 20 million, but its budget was also almost that. So this was the most successful movie for that studio that year. But going over to Marty, Who's That Knocking at My Door? It made 70,000 at the box office on a 16,000 budget. It obviously wasn't widely released. Mean Streets made 3 million on 650. So, She's Got to Have It is probably the biggest hit out of all of these. I'm trying to see if there's any other real fun facts without just jumping in. I think we probably just talk about it.
I read that. Yeah, go ahead,
Nick.
Jeff.
Go ahead.
Okay, all right. So the only other one I would add about Who's That Knocking at My Door is I read if you've seen the film, which I think we've given enough spoiler alerts. There's this really long extended sex scene in the movie that's kind of like a fantasy the character's having, and I read that they put that in because it does seem a little out of place in the movie, incredibly out of place, honestly. And I read that they put that in so that they could market it as like an exploitation film and get it like an NC-17, an X rating at the time. In the 60s, it would have just been rated X, and that might have like promoted it more because it could have been promoted more as like a risque film. I don't know if that really worked, but it's definitely a very out of place scene.
So on the outline, this is a look behind the curtains. On our outline that we have for our episodes, on our fun facts section there, I put secret fun fact because I wanted to see if this came up organically in the discussion of the film. And yeah, this film, they couldn't find anyone to pick it up and distribute it until finally a softcore porn distributor was like, "Yeah, we'll do it, but you got to put some boobs in it." I mean, like literally, that's what happened. And as they were trying to do this is probably 2 or 3 years or months, excuse me. Not 2 or 3 months. It's been many months since they originally shot it, and so they had to go back. And if you look at it again, Harvey Keitel's older. He looks substantial, not like decades older, but he looks like a much older man because he is. And they shot all of that in Amsterdam, and they had to. Martin Scorsese literally snuck the film for those extra scenes back in his pocket. He had the soundtrack in one pocket and the film in the other pocket because I guess I don't know if you can't transport softcore porn internationally, but he literally said that he had to basically smuggle it out of Amsterdam. And then they just wedged those scenes in there. So
Yeah, and the uh the editing reflects that. I think the editing is not good in that movie.
Oh yeah, it's
It's real bad. So
especially that, and part of that is also so his editor that he worked on with that is Thelma Schoonmaker, who's worked on him with basically every Martin Scorsese movie from 1990 onwards has been. There were a couple. She didn't do a lot with him in late 70s and 80s, but other than that, if you go look at the filmography, every movie she's in there with him, and she's won several Oscars. But I don't think she got to touch that part because it was inserted later. So yeah, it's very interesting.
yeah, so I mean with that, let's just dive right in. We'll start talking about who's that knocking at my door. I can lead off with this one. So I had not seen this. I haven't seen all four of these movies we're talking about. First time seeing them for this episode. So there's that. Now, for who's that knocking at my door? I will say that it's kind of like there's a little bit of Scorsese there, right? Like you can see it. But I, I think I think I liked it better than Mean Streets, just to kind of start off with that even, but it's it's very low rent. Obviously, Steve just talked about what the budget was, and we talked about the editing issues, and it's filmed in black and white, and not that was 1968. So filming it in black and white then may not have been as much of a choice. Like She's Gotta Have It is filmed in black and white, and that was very clearly a choice, especially because there's a specific scene where that is in color. So that was a specific choice by Spike Lee at the time, but I don't know for Who's That Knocking at My Door if it was a choice or if it was just a budget thing. I think at that point black and white was still cheaper, so I'm guessing it was probably done out of money needs. But so point being is that it being black and white is not some sort of aesthetic appeal. It was just something that he did. So um, yeah, first, I wasn't the hugest fan of it. I thought it was some of it was kind of interesting, but there was some. I felt like it kind of. And I think this is going to be a theme for Scorsese that we're going to come back to throughout this season, and I think it's apparent in both Who's That Knocking at My Door and Mean Streets, right? And I think it's in stark contrast to Spike Lee's to Spike Lee and his films, and that is about with the messaging and the sort of ideas they're trying to get across. I think Martin Scorsese has very famously struggled with his religion. And he's also sort of struggled with his own. Um, this probably wouldn't be his words, just because it's more of a newer thing, but sort of male toxicity, right? Like Raging Bull is a great example. We're going to talk about that later in the season, but um, a lot of you see a lot of it in these first two movies, even, and you can tell he's struggled with it, but I think one of Scorsese's strong suits, but can also be sort of a fault at times, is how raw he is when he brings these things forth. He doesn't hold anything back, and he puts it out there. And there is, specifically like when you talk about, um, with Who's That Knocking at My Door, just the relationship that Jr. JP. What's the name? What's Harvey Keitel's character? JP. Jr.
Jr.
Jr. Jr's character. There's this sort of intentional juxtaposition between the how he acts sort of with his boys, right? Like with his friends in the neighborhood, in the pubs, in the bars, how he acts there versus then that's interspersed with the with JR and the girl. She's literally not given a name, just the girl. And these scenes, it at first it was kind of weird where it's like, why is he it's almost like flashbacks that Harvey Keitel's character is remembering these conversations and dates and everything that he's had with this girl, and then you cut back and forth between that and then with him and his boys, and they're just hanging out and they're doing whatever weird shitty things they're doing, and it at first it was weird, and then it kind of made more sense. It was like this juxtaposition here is very intentional because it seems to me like he's trying to show the difference in how he's acting in these two different scenarios, how JR is choosing to present himself in these two scenarios, that he feels he has to present himself in a certain way, and he struggles with that. And religion comes into it, and all sorts of things where he even kind of talks about this sort of duality when he tries to explain the difference to the girl between a girl and a broad, right? Which is essentially his words were kind of, well, a broad is a girl that you kind of mess around with, but you don't marry a broad, but then a girl's someone you marry or whatever. And then that, shortly after that is where we get the sex scene, right? The weird, very weird sex scene. But so with Scorsese, this sort of rawness of just like not holding back, putting it all out there, really letting all this sort of stuff come through. But then I think his frustration that can kind of come through at times and can lead to some frustration as a viewer at times for me is it just kind of presents it and says like, okay, this is something that I know I'm grappling with, but it's just there it is, and that it's out there. Whereas I think with Spike Lee, at least from the ones I've seen, and then from these two movies, there's a bit more of a sort of decisive point and a sort of decisive direction that he's going, where he's saying, okay, this is the issue that I'm presenting, and here is some sort of conclusion to that issue. And I don't think for much of what Scorsese does, he doesn't necessarily present any sort of conclusion. And you don't necessarily have to either, obviously, to make good movies, because so many of Scorsese's movies are good. But I do think, and he has been very open throughout his career in a lot of interviews talking about his struggle with lots of these things, and that he still doesn't have answers for them, and he still struggles with them. He's 80 years old and he still talks about it. And so I think that comes through a lot. And I think that over the years he gets better at finding a way to channel that in a manner that is makes the films more successful, again, without getting too much into Raging Bull, because we'll talk about that. That I think is his kind of taking off point from when he really sort of locks in to who he is as a director and what these sort of things mean and how they can inform his films. But with these two movies, I think you can kind of see that struggle that he has with that, but you can still see what's there. And um I think that was the most interesting aspect to me. And I think with Who's That Knocking at My Door, and we can kind of talk about this maybe a little bit later when directly talking about that with She's Gotta Have It. But one thing I thought was especially interesting with that didn't necessarily come across as much in Mean Streets. It felt a little bit ahead of its time almost in dealing with agency of women and interrelationships between men and women. And definitely She's Gotta Have It had some of that as well, and I definitely want to dive into that um, a little bit later. But it's kind of interesting. And then again, season one to season two contrast. That's interesting. Is here we are with these four movies. We already have four movies that would maybe be the top four movies in terms of female representation for definitely for Steven Spielberg, but maybe for both um, directors from last season. So we're already off to a better start in that regard. But that's kind of my thoughts on Who's That Knocking on My Door.
There's definitely a reckoning that Martin Scorsese has that has been really interesting. It's great to watch his early movies, and I had never seen either of these two movies from Martin Scorsese. And there's a reckoning that you're starting to see now, really, and you've seen it throughout his career. I really think, and we'll get into this later in the season, but like the very last scene of Killers of the Flower Moon, I think the very last scene of The Irishman, where he's really admitting that these people he has depicted for years are not necessarily good people, and sometimes are very bad people. Um, there's this interesting moment in there's this interesting moment in Who's That Knocking at My Door. There's this really pivotal moment where this the girl st- uh, basically tells the story about how she was assaulted. She was raped by a former boyfriend. And
It's a
the JR character,
very brutal scene.
it's a very brutal scene. And it's hard to watch. And then JR has what I would call an all-time terrible reaction to a woman telling you that that has happened. Um, and there's an even worse reaction where she tells him, and then he goes back later and he actually he actually uses the phrase, "I forgive you." And it kind of had me in like the like the Doctor Evil meme, like, you just don't get it, do ya? I mean, it's just like that's like what I wrote down in my notes. I'm just like,
Couldn't have said that one,
bro,
Jr.
Yeah, it was
like that, like
it
that's
was like
not what you.
the
You're
worst
just like
case of
still not
victim
getting it.
blaming I've ever seen.
No, it's terrible.
Oh my god.
And I think though it's good in the sense that you're supposed to see it as like, wow, he's really being a bad person. It's not playing that up at all. We're not supposed to be sympathetic to his character at all. We're supposed to feel really, really bad for this nameless female that divulges this really personal thing to him, this awful thing that happened to her, and it's depicted in this really brutal way, and he can't handle it. Um, I see it in Mean Streets as well. I mean, I see there's just sort of this, and it's. And I think sometimes a little bit more in Mean Streets it's played for comedic effect, but I feel like the formula for every single scene in Mean Streets is guys come into like some sort of social, like a bar, some sort of social area. They start talking. They eventually start arguing. Somebody says, "What's the matter with you?" in this like thick Italian American accent. Then they start fighting. Like that's what every single scene is. And I think definitely in like the pool hall scene, like it's almost supposed to be played for comedic effect. Um, but they really beat you over the head with that. Just like, my God, these guys can't resolve anything. There's nothing they can resolve without coming to blows. So I that's it's interesting to me to look at his very first two films to see how he's dealing with that, and it's definitely something that he wants to depict, and to see how he has continued to depict that, because art, and I think we're going to come back to this a lot. Martin Scorsese characters often are not good people. I mean, I mean, right up to Killers of the Flower Moon, his most recent film, where you are just watching really, really awful people, and how he has dealt with that, sometimes through a comedic lens, sometimes just trying to be ironic, sometimes trying to depict it as honestly as he can. It's interesting to see him work through those issues. So that was kind of my reaction watching the Martin Scorsese movies.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I agree with both of what you're saying, and I think so. He specifically said about who's that knocking at my door, and Jeff, you mentioned it at the beginning. It's part of this pseudo autobiographical trilogy of his life, right? The first movie was never made, but this is the kind of the first one. It's him as a young man. Jr. is sort of a Martin Scorsese stand-in. Obviously, not necessarily in all the things he does, but he grew up in the same area. This was the way he lived, and he said at one point. Let's see. The movie. This is about the movie. It was accurate about the way we were when nothing was going on, just sitting or driving around. On one level, that's what the film was about. On another, it was about sexual hangups in the church. So, boom, boom, boom. Those are the three things this movie is about, right? And almost define his career. And one thing, you're talking about, Jeff, and I think these two movies, especially when compared to the two Spike Lee movies, where there is a difference, I think Scorsese is very much, and he even says this at one point in one of the interviews that I read. These two movies are about the characters, right? And the plot is almost irrelevant. Mean Streets more so. There's more of a plot in Mean Streets. But in Who's That Knocking at My Door, we really don't even have a plot until like 2/3 to 3/4 of the way into the film.
It
And
really does. I wrote down that it just seems like a series of vignettes
yeah,
more than it's like this random slices of life,
yeah,
and there's
exactly.
no real single storyline. Yeah.
Which is what he intended, but does that make for a great film? It's up to the viewer, I guess, but he in both of these films I think is very much focused on the characters, character, not so much the plot, whereas Jeff, as you said, Spike he obviously does great characterization, but there's a point to it all. There's a driving focus on it. There is a plot. Whether he, wraps it all up in a timely and satisfying fashion, I don't know. We'll discuss that later, but there is a point to it, and I'm not sure that there necessarily is one to the two Scorsese films at the, these first ones.
Yeah, and it's funny that you talk about the bar scenes and stuff like that. We talked about this last year with the sort of through line for a lot of Spielberg's work was this panning shot that he would do right outside of a car. That was a signature of his. A signature of Martin Scorsese's is the bar scene introduction. Dude loves it. It's like his go-to. It's like the comfort food for his filmmaking.
Rolling Stone needle drops. Rolling
Exactly.
Stone needle drops all day.
I have written down, I have one of the first two things. I said, could we have picked two directors who like needle drops more than these two directors? Number one, maybe Quentin Tarantino, but that's like the
Yeah,
only
it's
one.
the only one.
And then the bar scene, because it's just, and you in Mean Streets, as soon as I saw it, I was like, yep, okay, now I know it's definitely a Scorsese movie. He rolls in and it's just like, oh, there's Tommy two times or whatever, and it's actually kind of funny. Another similarity between Mean Streets and She's Gotta Have It. They also have these like sort of weird title cards for introducing characters, which was kind of strange, but
Yeah,
sure.
that's a good observation. I didn't even realize that they both did that, but yeah, especially means well. And who's that? Do they have the names? I can't remember.
I don't think so.
But yeah, who Mean Streets? You're right. Kind of just like She's Gonna Have It.
Yeah, and so I have a fun fact that I got because I was watching Mean Streets. Robert De Niro was in it, and Harvey Keitel as well. And so we're starting a rule now. Every season, the first movie from the director has to star Harvey Keitel. It's 2 seasons in a row. We've got it, and with 3 movies because these are
Yeah,
both Scorsese movies. But
he's the connecting thread of the universe. Is
there
really
you
the
go. But I was wondering, I was like, is Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro friends? They've been in like 5 movies together and all that. So I looked it up. I just Googled, are they friends? And they are friends. And interestingly enough, Harvey Keitel was actually the one who convinced Robert De Niro to do Mean Streets because Robert De Niro, Martin Scorsese, and Harvey Keitel, I think they all grew up in like the same area or the same neighborhood, even. And they all kind of, if they didn't know each other, they knew of each other. I think Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro, they knew each other from high school, I think.
Keitel and Scorsese actually had like seen each other around the hood. He said that they were on different streets, but they were in both in Little Italy at the
That might
exact
be
same
okay.
time.
That's the one I'm thinking. That was yeah. But then Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro knew each other just I think through acting circles or whatever, even though they're all from New York as well. But um, De Niro, at this point in his career, he didn't want to do the movie because Scorsese came up to him and said, you can have any role except for Charlie, which is the main character that Harvey Keitel was playing. And then De Niro was going to do it, and then he decided he wasn't going to do it, and he was talking to Keitel about it, and Keitel was like, "Well, why don't you want to do it?" And he said, "Well," and the interview I read, De Niro was saying that this was arrogant of him looking back now, but that's what he said at the time, which was, you know, at this point in my career, I should be a leading man. I should be the Charlie role, not, he wasn't saying it to put down Harvey Keitel or anything. He was just saying why he wasn't going to do it. He's like, I should be the Charlie role. And so then Keitel convinced him to be, I can't remember his name of his character, Mikey or something. Johnny.
Johnny boy.
Mikey, Johnny, um, and so that was how they got to do it, which was kind of funny. But yeah, your description, Nate, of just they all go to a bar and then somebody says, "What's the matter with you?" Like this movie, man, I like it. Just the whole movie was just like, "Hey, what are you doing?" Like every stereotype you could possibly imagine. Like within the first like 15 minutes, Robert De Niro's character, they're like, "Oh, you got to pay this guy. What are you doing?" And then they're all like confronting him, and he's like, "Hey, I'm gonna pay him." Like it's just very, very Robert De Niro.
I talked to I was actually talking to my dad about this, that I'd never seen Mean Streets, and the year before Mean Streets comes out, The Godfather, the first Godfather film, comes out. And obviously that was a much bigger like studio production. But there was some pretty legitimate concern at the time from Italian American communities that it would perpetuate negative stereotypes of Italian Americans, The Godfather. And because it deals with organized crime and stuff. But you see that if you watch The Godfather, which I'm obviously a huge fan, it's not really like that at all. I mean, they're part of a crime family, but they're all different kinds of people. And you have Michael Corleone, who's very like stoic and contemplative and stuff. I feel like Mean Streets is so much worse. Like I feel like every single one of these guys is just sort of a caricature. And again, from the the warning at the beginning of this episode, like I'm not telling Italian Americans when they should be offended, but it seemed to me, as someone who's not Italian American, that's just like every single one of these guys, it's like they have these really affected accents. It's always like, what's the matter with you? And then they're completely impulsive, like they instantly start fighting each other over anything. And every single situation just completely gets blown up out of hand. And I really do, particularly in the pool hall scene, I almost feel like Scorsese is like playing that for laughs. I mean, you've got De Niro up on a pool table with like a broken pool stick, like smacking people and getting tackled off the table and stuff. Like
I wrote
I
down in
almost
that scene, is this a comedy?
like, is it? Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't, it feels like they're kind of trying to play. And then the cops come in, and the guy's like, "Oh, I know these guys. He's my cousin." He's like trying to get them all off the hook so that the cops leave and stuff. He like bribes the cop, and he pays him off, and the cop leaves. It's just like, I don't know. And again, Mean Streets was not as big of a film. It wasn't a big studio production, but I look back at that time and all the concerns centered around The Godfather and stereotypes of Italian Americans. Then I see this movie, I'm like, God, this seems way worse than anything in The Godfather, but I don't, it's not for me to say, but Jesus, man.
I, I think you're on point with all of it. To specifically answer your question about the pool hall scene, he specifically says, "For me, there's no such thing as senseless violence. In the fight in the pool room, I held it long because of the sense of helplessness, the silliness of the whole thing." Yeah, he wanted to just illustrate the.
But
I
that's
mean, these
it.
are
Yeah, that it just feels silly. Yeah.
yeah, these guys are doing it. It's just there's no point to any of it, and you see that right afterwards too when they're everybody except for Johnny, who's shown as kind of an anomaly, like he is too impulsive. But everybody except for him, they're all just like, all right, we'll have a drink, and, they're just
Right.
backslapping
It's
again.
like, it's like, all right, let's just get back over here. We'll sort
Right.
this all out.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I think that there is some, obviously, like you just read the quote, but even during, I was like, there's definitely some intentionality here because he's trying to show how violence permeates this hyper specific culture here of this neighborhood and the area of New York, etc. And so it's kind of like, okay, I can see what you're trying to do necessarily, but I don't know. It just for both the movies and especially for Mean Streets when it comes to just the trying sort of to talk about how the violence permeates everything. It just didn't quite hit for me. I wrote down during watching Mean Streets. It just even though it is the more maybe plot centric of the two, I still felt it just kind of meandered more. It was about a half hour longer. It was closer to 2 hours. And Who's That Knocking on My Door is only an hour and a half, so maybe that helped. But it just kind of meandered, and then it was like these sort of things would just pop up, and then all of a sudden they're really big deals, and it just things didn't feel as quite fleshed out. And with Mean Street specifically, I thought one of the things that, and again, this is part of what I was talking about, where Scorsese kind of puts it out there and lays it out, and then doesn't do as much with it. Because there's the scene where, um, you know, from the early points in the movie, we kind of get this idea that Robert De Niro has a crush on this black woman who's a dancer at the club that he's. I don't know if he works there, if he knows he's friends with those people, whatever. I'm sorry, not Robert De Niro. I'm sorry, Harvey Keitel. Harvey Keitel has a crush on this woman, and eventually he asks her out on a date. She says yes, and then he takes a cab to go to this date. And as he's driving up, he sees her waiting next to the restaurant, and then he tells the cabbie, he says, "Just turn around and take me back to where you came from." He's like, "I'm sorry, just take me back." And then he gets a voiceover in his head. Another Martin Scorsese through line, voiceovers, right? I'm sure we'll definitely hit on that. But He gets a voiceover in his head, and he's saying, "What am I doing? I can't be seen." Um, Seen how he uses an Italian slur for black people. He's like, I can't be seen with with this person in public. A- And then he kind of turns around and goes home, and that's the last we see of it or hear of it. There's no sort of confrontation of like, why'd you stand me up? Or like they don't say, oh, this woman, she quit, she decided she don't want to work here anymore. And he has to kind of grapple with the fact, just nothing. And so it's like you present this sort of issue and you recognize that it's an issue and you're drawing attention to it, but then does nothing with it. And there's another scene in Mean Streets where, like, weirdly, this guy draws a swastika on the table, and then he says, like, to call over Harvey Keitel, he's like, "Hey, I made a self portrait of you," and it's what? What is this? And they're just, there's this. I think there's a point to be made about how this sort of casual racism permeates this society or this culture that they're in. But again, he didn't do much with it. And I think that, I think there's something to be said for just sort of displaying what how these things interact and how they affect so much of the lives of these characters. But then I just didn't feel like there was as much follow through with it. Whereas when, I watched Spike Lee's movies, these first two, 100%. There was presenting the issue, and then there was a major follow through for all of it. And I I think that, that's the major difference that I see from those two. Because to jump into Spike Lee's work, I had never seen either of these movies before either. And She's Gotta Have It. I gotta say, I was freaking blown away by this movie. This is a fantastic film. I had no idea. And the I can see immediately, you can see traces of what Martin Scorsese would become with his first two movies, but he wasn't there yet. But I could see immediately and could tell, if somebody in 1986 sees this movie, it's like, okay, this guy has an immense talent. And it was the way this movie was shot, with the I shouldn't say shot necessarily, as just with the sort of faux documentary, mockumentary like approach, where they're talking to the camera, sort of breaking the fourth wall, and all these characters are giving their sort of side of the story, almost Rashomon esque, the way they sort of.
That was one of his influences for the movie.
Oh,
So
was it
yeah,
interesting? Okay, yeah, and that is just, it was so well done. And then you had, because She's Gotta Have It is about a woman who is essentially polyamorous. She wants to just maintain multiple relationships, with multiple men at the same time, and doesn't see anything wrong with that. But of course, all three of the men do. And she's very upfront with these men, and she tells them about the other men and what she's doing and all this sort of thing. And it's this, like, it's just a refreshing amount of sort of, not only female agency, but female agency with sexuality that was, especially in 1986, would have been massively ahead of its time. And to see that, and then see sort of, and this is where we get back to the disclaimer again too. Like, I don't obviously have the experience of being a black person, but just from seeing, movies and reading stuff about it, you hear about these sort of, even within black culture, there are these sort of, infighting almost, where you can have these people who, like, lots of times it actually comes up a lot in school days of, like, essentially, you're not black enough or something. Like, these are things that sometimes get said. And so you have these, each man sort of represents almost sort of different part of black culture. And I thought it was really interesting how they're, sort of representing these different things and then projecting themselves and their own hangups onto Nola, the main character. And I just thought that was fascinating and so incredibly well done, and how different each character was. And to see, not only how they projected onto her, but then how she reacted to each one of them individually. Like, I just thought it was so incredibly well done, and just, I was blown away by this movie.
I think what differences here, at least in their early films, is that, we just talked about mean streets and kind of perpetuating maybe these negative stereotypes of Italian Americans. What Spike Lee is clearly deliberately trying to do here is shatter stereotypes of Black Americans and show that Black people are not one segment of society. Black people are all kinds of different people, and have their own hopes and their dreams and their own autonomy, and they all think differently about different things. I think it's fascinating that his very first, again, the representation of women, his very first film here, where the main character is a woman. Um, and what's interesting about it is I think it's almost like these men are so uncomfortable with her because basically she's the man. She's the one that is kind of controlling sort of the sexual politics of the whole thing. So I feel like there's even this femininity to it where he's kind of shattering these sort of feminine stereotypes as well, and how women are typically depicted in film. So that's really the main juxtaposition I see. And you also brought up with School Days how, um, these issues of, excuse me, these issues in Black America of, like hair texture and what kind of hair you have, and what they would refer to as colorism, like the skin tone of, of Black person's skin tone, and how there's this infighting in the community. And again, he's depicting that as that Black people are sort of all kinds of people, and even Black people are, and to speak frankly, he's showing that there's racism within the Black community toward each other. And I think that he's, in a way, he's, I think, almost being a little bit critical of his own community there. Which I think, for a young filmmaker like that, probably in the 1980s, was a hard thing to do and a risky thing to do and a really brave thing to do. And you really see it come through in those films. And I agree with you, Jeff. I had seen a little bit of School Days, but I never actually sat and watched the whole thing. The one scene I'd never seen in School Days that I loved was the beauty shop music number, where it's talking about these issues with hair and hair texture, but he does this thing where he almost sanitizes it, and it's played up like it's this old-fashioned Hollywood musical. It's a brilliant scene. It's a great music number, and it's original, and it's creative, and it just jumps off the screen. And I was really blown away by it. And I have to say, I mean, for like something like that, if we're starting to think about comparing these two, who's going to win this week, there was nothing like that in either Scorsese film that really took my breath away. It was like, wow, that's so original. I'm not sure that I've ever seen, certainly when Spike Lee did this, that was the first time that any filmmaker had actually did this, that talk about these issues within the African American community, and then to present it in sort of this purposely sanitized way, almost in sort of this ironic way with this music number, is a really brilliant creative choice that I think speaks to his immense talent and his immense bravery at that time in his career.
That's interesting because, like, I will agree in the sort of context of the scene itself. Like, it was really well done, but I think that scene, and not necessarily the subject matter, but the sort of tonal shift, is one of the sort of issues I had with School Days. I think it that movie in particular, I didn't find to be as good as She's Gotta Have It. And I think a part of the reason was, two of the complaints I had from that is, number one, I could not tell if it was trying to be a comedy or if it was trying to be entirely straight. Like, it kind of, there was like the speech of the football coach, before the game, and
I
these sorts of
think
things.
yeah, so that scene I really do think is trying to be deliberately funny. And if it's not, I feel bad because I did laugh out loud when he's like, do you want to lose the homecoming game for the
Yeah.
fourth year in a row? Like,
Yeah,
no.
right.
He's like, do you want me to lose my job? And I'm like, no. Like, I
You
really feel
hate the
like that's
devil.
supposed to be played for laughs. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there's, I really do think, but I do agree that tonally it's a little bit weird because there really are these hard shifts in the movie, and that is definitely present in School Days. I would agree with that.
Yeah, because specifically like the you get to the climax of the movie, right? And Spike Lee himself plays another character in this movie. He plays Half Pint, who is rushing a fraternity. And at the beginning, it almost has sort of like almost like Revenge of the Nerds type vibes to it, where they're on campus and they're pledging and they're doing silly things. They're pretending to be dogs, and they're getting yelled at by the active members of the fraternity and stuff. And then um the climax of the movie, they get in, right? The pledges get in, and then sort of a subplot of the movie up to this point was that Half Pint was a virgin, and how he the main leader of the fraternity was like, I'm not going to pledge a virgin. And so once he finally makes it in, he's like, okay, I told you I wasn't going to pledge a virgin. So now he coerces his own girlfriend, Tisha Campbell, of Martin fame. I don't know if any of you guys watched Martin. Man, I loved watching that show growing up, dude. Yeah, Brandon knows. But so he coerces her into sleeping with Half Pint. They put them both in a room, and they all sit outside the room in this just like horribly, horribly uncomfortable, very, very sort of, almost as hard to watch as the scene in Who's That Knocking at My Door, where she's crying as she's walking into this room, and then she gets in there, and then at first, Half Pint, Spike Lee's character, is like, oh, you don't have to do this, and then she's like, no, I want to prove how much I love my boyfriend, and he told me this is how I can do it, and so let's do this. And it's a very, very uncomfortable scene. But the scene right before it, where they're all getting in, they had to do their sort of final pledge walk, and there's all this silliness going on, and they're yelling at the pledges' faces and making all these jokes, and then you just kind of, and then they're having this party, and then there's this dance on campus, and um they're everybody's in their swimsuits at this swimsuit or beach themed dance or whatever, and they're all dancing like crazy, and then they're having a pledge party, and then all of a sudden we get to this, and what is basically rape, right? And it just tonally, this shift from here to there, and there are multiple instances like that in the movie where I think it just kind of worked against itself in those ways. But um when we go back to what you're talking about with the infighting in the Black community, I think it's really interesting how that was presented here, right? Because you had the fraternity members and the women, that were sort of, I couldn't tell if they were actually in a
Yeah,
sorority or
they're
if they
like
were just kind of like,
auxiliaries. I was gonna
yeah,
ask,
it was,
you're a resident Greek expert here. I think you're
yeah,
the only one of us that was actually in a fraternity.
that's right, I was.
Are the is a female auxiliary club a thing? Like, because as far as I could tell, they weren't a separate sorority. They were just
No, now
groupies for the
I went
fraternity.
to a small school. I don't know if it takes, if it's different at bigger schools. I still don't think it is. Like, it's not uncommon to have sort of a sorority that a fraternity is sort of more attached to, and
Sure.
that you may, you know, party
Yeah.
with, or do more events with and stuff. But in terms of having unaffiliated women who are like specifically tied to the fraternity,
Yeah, I
unless
thought
they're
that
like
was
dating,
strange.
yeah, unless they're dating somebody in the fraternity, it's not something that I'm familiar with. So that was, I couldn't really tell what was going on there. But regardless, those women, and then the other women on campus who were sort of in this group headed up by Lawrence Fishburne, young Larry Fishburne, as he was called. Um, and so they were, and it seemed like they were purposely all sort of darker skinned Black people, and then a lot of the people in the fraternity and the women associated with them were sort of lighter skinned Black people, and that was a sticking point. They specifically called this out, the characters in the movie, and sort of you know talking down to one side or the other about what their issues were with how those particular groups were presenting themselves and everything. And then the Lawrence Fishburne side, who was essentially making fun of the other side for wanting to be white, as they've said that in the movie, then they
Yeah, they
go out.
called them the wannabes, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that literally
wannabes,
was
that's right,
their.
yeah. And so then Lawrence Fishburne and his friends, they go out to eat, and then Samuel L.
the
Jackson
KFC
shows
scene?
up
Yeah.
randomly. But Samuel L. Jackson and a couple of his buddies, and they're clearly older. Their characters are older.
And critically, they're townies, right?
Yeah, they're from the whatever town the school is in. It's called Mission College. I think it's supposed to be
Yeah,
kind of
it's
an analog
fictional.
for
It's
Morehouse.
That's where he went,
That's where I thought
right?
that's where Spike Lee went. Yeah, okay.
And he wanted to film it there, but they shut it down days before filming started. Actually, it turned out to be could have been a big deal. Anyway,
Yeah, and Morehouse is what's one of commonly referred to as an HBCU, historically black college and university, and so that's what Mission College in the movie was. But then they go into town and they they're eating, and then Samuel L. Jackson and his group, and then they sort of get into a tussle with them, and then now Samuel L. Jackson and his group are talking about how Lawrence Fishburne and his group, they aren't black enough because um they're college boys, right? They're not like their experience wasn't the same as what Samuel L. Jackson and his friends what experience was. And this goes back to Nate, what you were saying. Like it's both, and She's Gotta Have It and In School Days. He's kind of drawing out this point that you know there is no definitive
yeah,
blackness, right? Like there's all these different types of people and experiences, and they and in School Days, I think a little bit maybe to its detriment, after all these sorts of things happen, they almost have these sort of like breakdowns done by the characters in the movie, right? Because right after this experience with Samuel L. Jackson and them, they're driving back to campus, and they dissect this experience almost perfectly. And it's weird to it kind of took me out of it for a little bit because I'm like, okay, a bunch of 20 to 22-year-old kids. I don't know if I was in college, if I had, not even necessarily having to be about black people and black culture, but just being able to fully understand at that point in my life certain things enough to have as intelligent of a breakdown of it. I don't know if that how realistic that was, but maybe it is because
I
it's something that they lived more than obviously I
see.
have. So
I
I'm not sure.
really like that because that was obviously it's in the context of our, what, like you said, Samuel L. Jackson basically criticizing them for quote not being black enough, but that sort of feeling of are you living up to expectations, or for any sort of, like, say you're if anybody has imposter syndrome type thoughts, right? Lawrence Fishburne wants to be a radical and go for these revolutionary ideas and support them, but even he, as pointed out by the Samuel L. Jackson character, he if he hasn't lived someone else's lifestyle, can he really claim to be that? I think that's a universal feeling for anybody in any sort of endeavor, right? At least for me personally, like, thinking about things where maybe you're not. Again, I think this goes back to the imposter syndrome thing, and the fact that they all sat there in the car and discussed it, and you could see the realization hitting them. I thought that kind of actually really worked. It seemed like something. It felt to me like certain thoughts and feelings that I had in college, like when you feel like you're, again, not a radical or whatever, but you're like, in college you're trying on new thoughts and ideas, and you're learning about uh, different politics and cultures and everything, and you're just kind of absorbing it all. And when you realize, oh, you don't really know what you're doing either, these other, it's almost like you're kind of a poser too. And the fact that they sat there and they thought about it, and then they tried to rationalize their way out of it in the car. I don't know. I thought that scene really worked. I thought it was very, very interesting.
I think the end of the confrontation is really telling as well because they're outside of this Kentucky Fried Chicken. Samuel L. Jackson is going on this rant, and he's using the N word. He's using a racial slur, and he's identifying all of them by that racial slur. And there's kind of this moment of like the Lawrence Fishburne character really trying to get him to not accept that self identity. And he literally, instead of going back at him and yelling at him, he just goes right up into Sam Jackson's face, and he says like, "You're not an N word. That's
That
not
was super
who you
powerful.
are."
Yeah.
And then they
That
just
was that
walk
was
away, and
that
they
was
give it.
really that was really good.
Yeah, and it's one of my favorite moments in the movie where he's just like, "You don't like you're even identifying yourself this way, and
Yeah.
he's almost saying to him like you're kind of part of the problem, that you're identifying all of us this way. It's
I thought
again,
that was the most powerful part of the movie.
yeah, it is. It's a great moment. And it's cool to just it's cool to see the Lawrence Fishburne character just like doing everything he can. Because I mean, I think Steve, to
Yeah.
what you're saying is like he really does want to speak for the black community. He wants the black community to prosper, and yet he's fighting all these different things, and he's kind of fighting, as his girlfriend kind of confronts him with, is like he's kind of fighting his own prejudices, because he even has these issues with quote unquote wannabes, more light skinned black people,
Yeah.
and he has kind of these internal prejudices as well, and you can tell there's this internal conflict, and when it comes down to this sort of almost this altercation, almost a fight in this parking lot, he just tells this guy this, where he's just like, we're not this thing that you're saying that we are. We don't have to identify ourselves that way. It's really powerful,
Yeah.
I
Just
think.
reject the entire paradigm. So, Jeff, one thing you were kind of mentioning, and I think here's how I defined the movie or described the movie in my mind. Um, Meandering. I think it meanders a little bit. He does. It's almost like he's trying to cram so many topics in. The HBCU experience, the um, topics of racial politics internationally, and what can we as Americans, what should we be doing about that? The Like we talked about the
Because sorry,
colorism,
for context on that, they're talking because at the time this was during apartheid, and so
yeah, good point.
a big issue was talking about South America or South Africa and getting rid of apartheid. That was one of the big things Lawrence Fishburne's character was going after.
Yeah, and it's just one of so many things that Spike Lee wants to hit on. It seems like in this movie, um, the fraternity experience, that alone, like you said, it almost seems like it's a bit manic, and just there's so many topics that are being covered, and while it does have a plot, it like I said, kind of meanders amongst them instead of being just aimless like the Scorsese films. I think we can go ahead and say that, even though Mean Streets is a little bit tighter, this one is just a bit. It has a direction it's going in, but it takes its time getting there. Unlike Do
And
the Right
one,
Thing, also critically, which I think it's very on
yeah.
track and on pace.
So I wonder if, and
Or
this would
she's
be a
got to have.
great
Sorry.
question. This would be a great thing to ask Spike Lee. And Steve, I don't know if he speaks about this in that biography, that autobiography you were talking about, or where I don't know, it's a transcript of an interview, that book. There's on the notion of trying to squeeze in as many issues as he possibly can. But these first three films, but particularly School Days, and then I think what we're going to watch, Do the Right Thing, there's a part of me that almost wonders if Spike Lee thought he wasn't going to get a chance to make that many more movies. And he felt like, I have to speak with the truest voice possible, because look, I'm a black filmmaker. Black filmmakers, you look around, they're not getting a lot of chances. I am speaking directly to black issues, which is not going to have a wide appeal. Is maybe even going to be not well received within the black community. And I really do wonder, particularly as I watch School Days, and to your point of him trying to cram in so many different issues, is like, did he think maybe that he was not going to have that many shots, and so he had to do it, because he does this movie and then he gets to do the right thing, which we'll talk about later, but is this huge success, and is this huge critical success. And then it's not till I think it's his fourth film, is Mo Better Blues, which is more of like a musical. Um, and it's the first. It obviously deals with issues of being a Black American, but not so directly and aggressively as these first movies. And I wonder if that was after it kind of took the success of Do the Right Thing for him to kind of be like, wow, like maybe I am an established filmmaker, that might like a studio is now going to always feel comfortable giving me some amount of money to make a movie. Um, that's just kind of how I feel watching School Days, on the idea that like he's trying to squeeze in so many different topics and get them all in, because maybe he thought he wasn't going to have that many chances to make a movie.
I
And that's
don't
really
know.
go ahead.
I don't know if he specifically speaks to that. I don't think he would ever again, knowing the guy like I do so well, reading through this first part of the biography, but I don't think he would ever have said that. But there is a point after School Days comes out where he made a statement. He didn't want all of. He wasn't going to be this representation. Him and his cast and crew and characters and stuff weren't going to be this representation for all black people. He didn't want all their hopes and dreams riding on him. But everything that he does, from hustling so hard to get these movies made to going out of his way to say to specifically use people, specifically crew members in a lot of instances that aren't union, and digging in and fighting, because they're not union just because they haven't had exposure. These people they're not in the system, right? But he is supporting black people in the crews, in the staff, from at all parts of the production. I think everything he does kind of speaks to what you're saying. Like, even if he didn't consciously think that, I think he may have subconsciously felt the weight of the fact that he's a lot of, black filmmaking in America, especially after the success of She's Gotta Have It. It's not that it was riding on him, but I think there had to be an enormous amount of pressure, even if he consciously wasn't thinking that.
Well, and so I just looked up, and this is another filmmaker that we'll probably bring up. In 1991, so I'm looking at, so Do the Right Thing comes out in 1989, and then in 1991, kind of on that idea of like speaking for all of Black America, Boys in the Hood comes out in 1991. That's also this huge commercial critical success that's very much speaking from this black identity, and honestly a little bit different than Spike Lee. I mean, it's speaking very much from a place where it's incredibly low socioeconomic status. They're growing up in this incredibly impoverished area. Interestingly, Lawrence Fishburne is in that movie as well. And so maybe I think, kind of on that note, like maybe he feels some of the pressure come off, and he kind of starts to feel more comfortable with this idea of like, I don't have to speak for every Black American. I'm glad that I opened doors for other Black filmmakers to make their movies because I don't need to speak to every single issue.
Another interesting thing too is especially in School Days, there is a little bit more this sort of idea of intersectionality, which has been a big thing in discourse last couple years, just in like the internet and stuff. But it's because there's obviously the very clear issue of race and everything, but then with School Days in particular, there is the also, and it's also in She's Gotta Have It, but just not to the same degree, but just the sort of feminine side of the black culture. So you've got what we've talked about before, this sort of infighting, if you will, of what it means to be black and all that. But then there's also, black women have to deal with all of that on top of being a woman, right? And
Mhm.
so that's the sort of barbershop scene where they're going back
Yeah.
and forth, that's coming not only from an angle of black cultural issues, but then also feminine issues as well. And then you get into that with the scene where Half Pint loses his virginity, and then there is a scene and She's Gotta Have It where
Yeah, this is what I was hoping
Nola,
you'd bring up.
shoot, what was the guy's name?
Which one?
The guy who assaults her essentially.
Oh, oh my God. It's like we didn't even watch the
I
movie.
know it was Greer, it was the other guy, and then it was
Greer
Mars.
was the
I
third
can't remember.
one. Mars was the second one, obviously.
Was it
I
John?
think it was Jamie.
Jamie. That's right.
Jamie,
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
So, there's a scene where Jamie and Nola get in this big argument, and then Jamie's kind of like, "Oh, is this what you want? You want me to take control?" And he rapes her basically, and it's very, very
Yeah,
uncomfortable, very brutal scene.
not even basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, she calls it herself in the movie a near
near
rape,
rape. I wrote
but
that
I
down.
think that was sort of intentional to draw attention to the
was.
fact that she is sort of changing it in her mind so that
Yeah.
that she wasn't actually raped, I think is kind of the way she did it. But
Spike has talked since then that like this is one of his biggest regrets. He feels like that he treated it far too cavalierly and like it treated it as not the horrific thing that it actually is. So
yeah,
I mean,
I can see that
it's
for sure. And
um
go ahead. Was there more, Steve?
oh, you go ahead and finish that thought. I thought you were going to bring up something else about the women and you know how people get it from all sides. Go ahead.
Yeah, and but just that I thought again for both movies, it's another thing that was really ahead of its time because these and it sort of comes back to what you were saying of maybe trying to tackle too many issues as well, but also but just I thought it was just I wasn't expecting that to be a part of it as well. And so, even in She's Gotta Have It, there's even a black lesbian character who is sort of, doesn't have a major role, but she's in it and they discuss it and they talk about um, sexuality uh and from that standpoint as well. And so it's just it was really in a very positive way. Not it wasn't presented positively, obviously, because of these horrific things, but just positive in the sense that it's he's digging into these issues and he's talking about them. And there's because it's also when it comes to women, again, like I said, it's not just being black; it's being black and being a woman. You've got these different things that you're fighting on different levels, and then sometimes at the same time, and that becomes very difficult. And he doesn't quite go into it maybe as much as he could, but the fact that it gets brought up at all and he kind of shows it out there is it was, I thought, something that was very impressive, and for both movies, I think kind of ahead of their time.
Yeah, and there's one particular scene also in She's Gotta Have It that I think it's telling about how again it's not just black people being discriminated against by white people, but there's also intra issues with colorism and things we talked about. But in a similar vein, in She's Gotta Have It, she's getting this just pure misogyny and physical sexual assault from the three guys, in some way, shape, or form. And then she has a nightmare, and the I presume fictional girlfriends slash wives of the three guys appear to her in the nightmare, and then she's even getting it from them. She's basically getting called, a quote, quote unquote loose woman or whatever. I don't want to use a slur or anything. Um, from women. I mean, it's her nightmare, but it just goes to show that things are just so complicated, and it's you can be yeah. Anyway, there you go. I liked how he included that too to just show that things are just so rough out there. She's getting it from every which way. Do you guys
Well,
go ahead?
I was just gonna say, I mean, talking about, I know I'm defending Spike Lee here, but I feel like the manner in which we've talked about it, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, I feel like the manner in which we've talked about it, to me, Spike Lee made the more interesting films this week. I feel like his earlier films are just more interesting than Scorsese's. I feel like he has more to say. Like he says it in a more interesting way. I feel like he's more brave with his choices, and I just feel like I mean, even right now, I feel like they've promoted more intellectual conversation than Scorsese's, but maybe I'm wrong.
I 100% agree. And I know we've gone long, but I also just kind of want to see from not just from an interesting standpoint, but just from a pure cinematic filmmaking standpoint. Do you guys have anything to say? The use of light and shadow that both of them are able to do, but particularly Spike Lee in She's Gotta Have It, I thought was worth calling out. So I agree with everything you say. I think the films themselves, what they're speaking about, are more interesting, more powerful. I think it shows a director already firing on not, if not all cylinders. He's jumped into the deep end and he's swimming immediately. Whereas Scorsese, it's very much a slower burn. Some of that is Spike Lee literally used Scorsese as inspiration, right? The reason he decided to shoot in black and white and She's Gotta Have It is because of Raging Bull. So I mean, you stand on the shoulders of giants. How many cliches and metaphors can I throw in here? But anyway, Jeff, what do you think?
I am going to have to agree with both of you because, yeah, I thought last season we kind of had this sort of moment with we talked about Ridley Scott with his first movie just seemed at that time a more confident and assured filmmaker than Spielberg was. And it didn't, obviously Spielberg improved and got to, be one of the most confident and assured filmmakers ever. But I kind of feel that way as well right now in this instance where talking about, strictly these first two movies early in their career. Spike Lee seemed much more confident and assured in what he was doing than Scorsese did. And there are nuggets of what makes Martin Scorsese in these movies. And I think kind of what I was talking about earlier, over the course of his career, I think he finds better ways and learns better techniques to sort of channel a lot of these things he struggles with into his films to make them better and more cohesive. Um, and I think but it just wasn't quite there yet. And I think Spike Lee was essentially right there. Like he knew exactly the films he wanted to make, and he went out and he made those films. And I'm sure every director has regrets and stuff, but especially with She's Got to Have It. I mean, you'd have to look back and be like, okay, I'm incredibly proud of this film, and that was the film that I wanted to make. Whereas I would guess if Martin Scorsese looked back at Mean Streets or Who's That Knocking at My Door, he would probably say, you know what, I could make those better today, and he definitely could, I think. But if you're Spike Lee today, he would come back and probably I would hope Spike Lee would say that She's Got to Have It is I don't know that you could make that much better today. He said he'd make the one mistake, he wouldn't be as cavalier about the rape scene, and obviously that's would be a good thing. But just generally speaking about the movie, I mean, again, I was blown away by that movie, so that's I think that
Yeah,
that
same.
alone would give him the nod. But I think even my issues with School Days, I think just as a collective, both those movies are definitely better than Who's That Knocking on My Door and Mean Streets.
think Steve, to answer your question a little bit, just from a little bit more of a filmmaking perspective, I think a theme that we're going to see a lot through this season that's very different than last season is these are two filmmakers very much indebted to ideas of postmodernism in film. That you have so like both of them start with like photographs. So for starters, they're both much more personal films, and they start with photographs. Or Mean Street starts with like the home video. You have characters talking directly to the camera and breaking the fourth wall. You saw that with, at the end of School Days, and then we're going to see that I think next week with the end of Goodfellas, where the character just breaks the. They make it more apparent to you that you're watching a movie, and that's not for everybody. But it's a kind of a newer, interesting thing that Spielberg and Scott don't really do. We talked about that a lot last season. That they build a world and they want you to go into that world and you escape into that world. Scorsese and Spike Lee want you to live and reckon with the world we're living in, and so they do that with these really postmodern techniques of having characters speak directly to you. It's interesting. Mean Streets. I had to look this up because I heard it, and I wanted to make sure that that very first piece of voiceover narration, it's not Harvey Keitel. It's actually Martin Scorsese's voice.
I
Yeah.
wrote that down. I
Who
was
Yeah.
like,
during
why is Martin Scorsese doing
yeah
this?
yeah. So it's stuff like that that I think is going to be really impactful for all these movies as we watch them. See it in their editing. Scorsese does, the real quick jump cuts, but then as his career goes on, he actually he spoke about this in an interview that he really now likes to depict violence in wide shots so that it's just kind of there, and it feels a little more jarring when it isn't cut around. There's a lot of that in his most in Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon, his more recent films. So I think we're going to talk a lot about those kind of techniques that make you really feel like you're watching a movie and what that movie is supposed to say about the world that we live in right now.
Completely agree. All right. So in the books, Spike Lee, taking week one. All right, off to a good start. So next week, week 2 is going to be the sort of quote unquote best week. Now, Spike Lee, and we'll probably talk about this because I know it's been a bit of a talking point in recent years. Spike Lee has never had a movie win Best Picture. Martin Scorsese has, but and that The Departed, by the way. But I think for most people, generally speaking, Goodfellas is considered sort of his opus, his sort of magnum opus, if you will. And for we've already mentioned it multiple times, just because of the thematic link to these two movies. But Do the Right Thing for Spike Lee is what many consider to be his best movie, and both of those movies are considered to be some of the greatest of all time. So that's the two movies we're going to be discussing next week: Goodfellas, Martin Scorsese, and Do the Right Thing from Spike Lee. So I have an incredibly hot take to give next week. So stay tuned for that when we when we talk about these two movies.
I genuinely am curious. Okay, I'll
All
wait a
right,
week.
I'll keep you in suspense. I won't even tell you off
Okay.
air until next week. All right. So, but yeah, Goodfellas, Do the Right Thing next week. This is gonna be a fun week. These are two fantastic films.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited to watch them from our sort of podcast angle and see kind of what we think is more indicative of the filmmaker, and then the best movie. So as we end week 1 here for season 2, any closing thoughts on these movies, guys?
On the movies, I think I'm sure there's a bunch more we could talk about, but I know there are because I have tons of notes. But I'm just still so shocked, and maybe I shouldn't be, that you guys, you picked two filmmakers that they pair together so well. There's so many similarities between their focus on, Italian Americans, minorities, the how they were raised just affects them so much. Their use of music, their postmodernism. It's just I'm thrilled that we're doing these two directors, and it's been borne out in episode 1. I think there's similarities.
I personally am going to take a drink while watching Martin Scorsese movies every time there is a character introduced in a bar with the Rolling Stones playing behind it. And I think that's going to happen a lot. I
What's the
think that's
matter
going to
with you?
Are
happen
you going to be able to
frequently.
record next week is the question.
I mean, I'm gonna be fine. But every time a character is introduced, I guess tell you what, it has to be classic rock. I won't hold them to the Rolling Stones, but every time there's a character introduced in a bar, it's a classic rock song or a doo-wop song. Scorsese really likes the old 50s doo-wop stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jersey Boys style. Yep.
Yep. So either of those things, I'll take a drink. I'll watch the movies a few days before we record, and I'll be fine.
He said about Mean Streets, for me, the whole movie was Jumpin' Jack Flash and Be My Baby. There you go.
There you go. That sounds about right. Okay. So with that, we'll end episode 1 here. Spike Lee takes the first week. Next week, Goodfellas, Do the Right Thing. Come back and watch the movies beforehand. You obviously didn't have a huge lead up. I guess maybe before we post this, we'll put some stuff on social media. But yeah, next week, if you want to watch along, if you haven't already seen Goodfellas and Do the Right Thing, you should watch them anyway. But especially for the podcast, go ahead and watch those. So with that, we'll see you next week. Thanks again for stopping by.
And we're done.
All right.
Go.
Good stuff.